Evdokimova, and I will be your moderator for this topic session. This session is being recorded. It will be available with all the materials by the link later. Please feel comfortable asking questions. Put your questions in the chat. We answer them at the end of the presentation. Please let me introduce the speaker. Andrea Borg came from sunny Malta. He's a senior QA engineer with a company called Catena Media. Catena Media is an affiliate marketing company which mainly operates within the iGaming industry. Andrea also founded a test automation quality assurance community and very first software testing conference. He's also very fond of Scrum methodology. I pass the word to Andrea. Please, Andrea, start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Larissa, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining my talk today, QA's role in a Scrum environment. Just to let you guys know, the talk will be around 40 minutes long, with a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end. Feel free to use the questions tab that you have been provided with, so we can discuss your questions and maybe any feedback that you have at the end of the talk. This is not a very technical talk, and I will try to make it as interactive as virtually possible. The reason why I decided to do this webinar is for the simple reason that I would go to some Scrum talks, some Scrum courses, some Scrum certification talks, and basically they would define the role of a Scrum Master and of a product owner within a Scrum environment, but they will not talk about a QA's role within a Scrum environment. And this irritated me a bit, and that's why I came up with this talk. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, you will have some tips and tricks on how to help in current situations, which at the moment is not clear for you. And you will also have the definition of what actually is a QA's role in a Scrum environment. And a QA which does not execute test cases and reports bugs and just testings, but a QA which can actually contribute to the Scrum team. To continue my introduction, yes, my name is Andrea Borg, and I am a senior QA engineer. And I founded Test Automation with two great friends of mine, Adrian and Wayne. Test Automation is basically a testing community where anyone can come up with a blog post and post it on our website. You can come up with any blog post you want, and we'll post it free of charge. So make sure to check it out, testautomation.com. Apart from that, I have also organized the very first software testing conference in Malta, Test Island 2019. Apart from my love for testing, I am also very fond of Scrum, hence giving this talk today. So, we're mainly going to be talking about Scrum today. We've been hearing about Scrum for so long. Probably most of you already worked in a Scrum environment. Others are transitioning to Scrum, while others have already tried Scrum and maybe didn't like it, so we moved on to another Agile methodology. But the fact is, today Scrum is the most popular framework used by software houses all over the world, or at least they think that they are using Scrum. What is Scrum and why is it so popular? Well, Scrum is an agile methodology designed for software development teams, with the customer or user as a central focus. Scrum Alliance defines Scrum as a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems, whilst productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. The Scrum framework consists of Scrum teams and their associated roles, events, and artifacts. Each component within the framework serves a specific person and is essential to the Scrum success and usage. I repeat the three must-haves: the artifacts, the roles, and the events. These are the three critical ingredients which your organization needs in order to use Scrum to its full value. If one of these is missing, then you are not completely working in a Scrum environment, and something is bound to go wrong. We'll be going through these three must-haves individually and how a QA can benefit and also contribute to each of these must-haves. Let's dig a little bit deeper and understand what each of these must-haves consist of. Over here we have a simple table of the must-haves with their formal and informal items. So if we start with artifacts, the formal artifacts are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the increment, and the informal item is the visual board. Moving on to the events, the formal events are the daily meeting, the planning meeting, the retrospective, and the informal events are the review and the refinement meetings. Finally, our third must-have has three formal roles, which are the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team. And the informal roles are the manager and the stakeholders. I'll be going through the items which I think us as QAs need to contribute more in order to show how much you can participate in these events. For example, I'll be talking about how we can participate more when it comes to the product backlog. Also, how we can use the visual board to our advantage. I will also be mentioning how I can participate in the planning and refinement meetings. And finally, I will be talking about the Scrum roles and where QAs fit in a Scrum team. But before that, let me show you a bit of how the Scrum framework works. As you can see from the image shown in the slide, it is like a cycle. These cycles are called sprints. Every sprint consists of the items which I have showed you before. So you start with the planning, then you have the implementation, then at the end of the sprint, you are going to deploy something, you are going to release something, and you're going to present something to your user. That is what we call the PSP, a potential shippable product. The most important thing about the sprint is at the end of the sprint, we produce this PSP, which is sometimes also known as the increment. Going back a few years, before the Scrum methodology, we had the waterfall model, which was the most popular framework before Scrum. As you can see, this framework is very different to the Scrum framework. Instead of being a cycle, they are phases. So they are passing from one phase to the next. So when the analyst is done, he passes the work down to the designers pass their work down to the developers, and then the developers pass their work down to the QAs. As you can see, this is the total opposite of Scrum, where Scrum, the implementation and testing is all done within a sprint, and work is not passed down from one stage to another as in the waterfall model. Another huge difference between Scrum and waterfall is that in Scrum, tasks are broken down into smaller pieces for the flow to be easier to both implement and also test. In the waterfall model over here, we can see that everything is done in large chunks, making the QA not only the bottleneck at the end of the day, but also having the most responsibility. So, let's talk about the first must-have, the Scrum roles. As I mentioned before, we have three formal Scrum roles. We have the product owner, we have the Scrum Master, and we have the development team. Together, these make up the Scrum team. But I can already hear you asking, Andrea, what about the QA? Isn't QA a role in Scrum? Well, developers are mentioned, the product owner is mentioned, so what about QA? Well, the fact is that that is a waterfall method of thinking. The QA is part of the development team. It is not a separate role. This means that the developers and the QA would be working as one in order for the common goal, to release the PSP at the end of the sprint. Testing is done within the development team, and testing is done in small chunks, and not when the application is already built, like in the waterfall model. So, now we know that a QA is part of the development team, and not a separate entity, and a development team, a Scrum Master, and a product owner create a Scrum team. But what is a Scrum team? Well, Scrum Alliance quotes that Scrum teams are self-organizing and cross-functional. But what does this mean? Self-organizing teams choose how best to accomplish their work rather than being directed by others outside the team. On the other hand, cross-functional teams have competencies needed to accomplish the work without depending on others not part of the team. Scrum teams deliver products iteratively and incrementally, maximizing opportunities for feedback. Boris Gloger also adds to his definition of Scrum team. Boris Gloger thinks that the team voluntarily commits to delivering functionalities within one sprint, in which it is accountable and responsible for the quality. This is very important, as this means that the quality is not the responsibility of the QA engineer or of the tester, but the quality is the responsibility of the whole Scrum team. The same thing goes for delivering the product. It's not the QA who delivers the product, but it's the entire Scrum team who delivers the product. So forget about the them and the us. It is now one Scrum team, one development team working together for that common goal. The common goal of getting the PSP out as a team. The PSP, which the quality is a joint responsibility by the whole development team. So I get a lot of questions of, Andrea, is this a good Scrum team, or does this abide by the Scrum team rules? Let me give one very popular example. So over here in this slide, we have 3 teams. 2 teams are made up of a product owner, backend developers, and front-end developers. The third team is a bit different. The third team is just made up of 1 QA lead and multiple QAs. Does this confirm with the Scrum team definition I gave before? Definitely not. And why? The simple reason that when teams 1 and 2 start working on their work, they finish implementing and coding, and they are done, they then need to pass the code to be tested to the third team. Thus, the teams are not cross-functional, and they are not responsible for the work. So if they find a bug, who is responsible? Is it just team 3? Who will take responsibility for that? This is a very waterfall methodology approach, which we need to forget about. We are now working in Scrum and not in waterfall. The only reason or the only example I can give where a team which is just made up of a QA lead and QAs confirm with the definition of a Scrum team is when this team is working, for example, solely on an automation framework. So they would use that automation framework as their product. For example, the QA lead may act as a product owner, and the QAs will be the ones developing the automation framework without interference or help from the other teams. In this case, then yes, a team made up of just QA leads and QAs can actually be a Scrum team. Next, the Scrum artifacts, our second must-have. Why do we need artifacts? Because artifacts maximize transparency. Maximizing transparency helps everyone in the organization to be on the same page. It also helps them to know what work is coming up, what work is in progress, and what we should expect from the upcoming sprints. The first formal artifact I would like to talk about is the product backlog. But not only, I would like to compare the product backlog with the team backlog, which, as you remember before, I did not mention as a formal or informal item of the artifacts. We have many backlogs in Scrum. We have the release backlog, we have the bug backlog, sprint backlog, team backlog, product backlog, the list goes on. But it is very important that we only add backlogs that we think our Scrum team needs. In my opinion, the team backlog should be something that a QA pushes for. Why should a QA push for the team backlog? Well, before I get into that, let me define what a product backlog and a team backlog are. So, a product backlog is a backlog which contains items which a product owner will create, which at the end of the day will benefit the user. So I'm talking about the normal features that we work on the day-to-day basis. For example, implementing a new logging system, improving our registration, a feature which, when delivered to the user can get a valuable gain out of it. On the other hand, a team backlog will contain tickets created by the development team, maybe discussed during the retrospective or any other meetings, which will benefit the development team themselves. Examples, for example, adding more unit tests, refactoring some code, and also maybe automated tests. What is the main difference between tickets in the product backlog and team backlog apart from this? Another critical point is that tickets in the product backlog need to be tested by a QA. Tickets in the team backlog do not need to be tested by a QA. And this will help the product owner and the Scrum Master better plan the upcoming sprints. Another reason that a QA should be in charge of what goes in the team backlog is for a simple reason that the QA must be the guide to make sure that these tickets that go into the team backlog do not need to be tested by them, right? So they can have time to work on their own team backlog items. For example, automated tasks, which they can add themselves. For example, improve Jenkins jobs, research on new automated tools, etc., etc. The next artifact we're going to be talking about is an informal artifact, which I'm sure all of you use on your day-to-day basis. We call this the visual board. The difference between the visual board I'm showing you here and probably the visual board that you are using on a day-to-day basis is the number of columns. As you can see over here, my visual board only has 3 columns. The visual board you probably use at work probably has multiple columns, probably have the to-do, on hold, in progress, code review, to test, PO approval, ready for release, released, done, the list goes on. While this is not a terrible thing, I prefer a nice and clean visual board with 3 columns for the simple reason that it is easier to track the work in progress limit. What is the work in progress limit? Basically, the work in progress limit is an agreed number of tickets that a person in the development team is assigned to at one point in time. So for example, at one point in time, a developer is assigned to 1 ticket from the product backlog and 1 ticket from the team backlog. What does this mean? This means that if in the in progress column you have 20 tickets and your team is made up of 5 team members, that is a red flag for the Scrum Master, because this means that someone is not keeping track of the work in progress limit. And this is why I like to have just 3 columns, because when you have 1 column, it is easier for the Scrum Master to track, whoa, there are so many tickets in the in progress column. On the other hand, with many columns, the tickets will be so spacely spread out that it will be difficult for him to track if everyone's keeping in the work in progress limit or not. But I hear you asking, okay, if we move to a 3-column visual board, like you're suggesting, how do I know when I need to test something? Well, that's easy. When a developer is ready from something and wants it to be tested, the ticket is assigned to you. You are probably the only QA in the team. And when a ticket is assigned to you, it means that the developer needs your attention, probably, and wants it to be tested. The same thing for code review. If a developer wants a particular developer to review his work, he will assign that ticket to him while in the in progress column. So, I mentioned what happens in the in progress column, but when do I actually move a ticket from the in progress column to done? That's a good question. And it is all related around the definition of done. I've been mentioning done quite a lot, but what do I mean by done? When I say by done, I'm referring to the definition of done, which is set by every team and is a dynamic document. Thus, it is not set into stone. Definition of done can be described as a checklist of things which the ticket that is being worked on needs to be checked in order to move a ticket from in progress to done. Items in this checklist can include add unit tests, make sure the unit test coverage doesn't decrease, get QA approval, get PO approval, get stakeholder approval. Another item I like to add to my definition of done is released. I like to add release as a definition of done for the simple reason that when release is not included in the definition of done, and that ticket is always nearly going to be released or maybe release it next week, this ticket will be moved from one sprint to the next. And who will be in the disadvantaged state because of that? Obviously the QA. The QA will always have to look at this ticket and make sure that it is going to be released while working on other stuff from that sprint. So setting released as one of the criteria for the definition of done will help the QA concentrate only on the stuff which was planned for that particular sprint and not move tickets from one sprint to the next because a ticket has not been released for a lot of different reasons. Another reason why I like to add released in my definition of done is for a simple reason, to show business how long it takes from when a ticket is created to when it is released. Usually this is a huge impediment, either because we have only one release day during the week, either because there are multiple teams in the same code base who want to release and our release gets put down the line in the priority backlog, etc., etc. So using definition of done will also help track data for the Scrum Master and also in order to show business, hey, this is the data that we collected, we have these impediments, and we have this to prove it. So that is my take on what should be included in the definition of done. Finally, the third and final must-have, the third and final ingredient that I would like to talk about are Scrum events. Scrum events help minimize the need for meetings not defined in Scrum. So the main purpose of Scrum events is to save time by removing needless meetings throughout the sprint. Scrum events help with transparency and being able to adapt. Scrum meetings will use the Scrum artifacts to achieve a sense of common understanding, not just within the team, but the whole organization. The first formal Scrum meeting I would like to talk about is the sprint planning. During the sprint planning, the teams decide on what work to be performed during the sprint and what will be the PSP that will be delivered at the end of the sprint, also known as the sprint goal. This plan is created by the collaborative work of the entire Scrum team. Two important questions discussed in the sprint planning are what can be delivered in the sprint and how they will be delivered. Unfortunately, QAs hate sprint planning. We feel left out during developer discussions and usually have no idea what to say or what to do. Well, this shouldn't be the case, and here are some tips and tricks of how a QA should participate in sprint planning. QAs take sprint planning lightly and underestimate our importance during the meeting. Different companies do planning in different ways. You can have, for example, sprint planning 1 and sprint planning 2, where sprint planning will tackle the question of what, and sprint planning 2 will be a bit more technical and handle the question of how. Usually QAs do not like the technical part of the how and they feel left out, but this shouldn't be the case. Even if the planning is too technical, you should sit down, listen, ask questions, for the simple reason that if you don't understand this ticket, how can you test it later on? Also, it is very important for the QA to make sure that they understand what is being discussed in order to write test cases, jot them down, and use them for when they are testing the ticket. Another important part of planning is to calculate the team capacity during the sprint. The team capacity is simply the number of hours available of the whole Scrum team combined during the sprint. Depending on the number of hours available, the team will commit to a number of user stories to be done during the sprint. I am mentioning this as most of the time there is only one QA within a team. So if you go on vacation, for example, and no one brings up the issue that you are going on vacation, the product owner and the Scrum Master will not know that you are going on vacation. Thus, the tickets which are planned for the sprint will not be tested, and probably you will not satisfy the definition of done, as one item of the definition of done will probably be approved by QA. What is even worse is that if you do not speak up during the planning that you will have reduced capacity during that sprint, is that when you come back from holiday, you will have a huge backlog to test, right? If you have a huge backlog to test, this will also mean that you will not get to the definition of done and not complete the sprint goal. And another problem is that you'll probably move a lot of tickets from one sprint to the next. So developers will be working on something during the sprint and the tester will be working on something different. And that's something that we do not want. This problem is a problem which is uniquely QA related. So if you're not bringing this up in the sprint planning, no one will. The final thing QAs take for granted in sprint planning is that even QAs should commit during a sprint. Don't forget about the team backlog, which I have mentioned earlier, and that you can add automated tasks or research tasks to the team backlog. You can raise your voice and say, guys, I really like to finish this automated task this sprint, but we didn't leave enough capacity. Can we swap something, please? Or, guys, I really want to do some research on this tool. Can I dedicate some of my time for the sprint? Make planning useful, don't waste it. Take the opportunity during planning to give enough time to improve yourself both as a QA and improve the processes of your Scrum team. Speaking up during planning is very critical. The next meeting I'm going to be talking about is the refinement meeting. Refinement is also known as groomings, estimations, etc. But the main aim of refinement is the act of adding details, estimates, and order items in the product backlog. Refinement meetings usually use tools like Scrum Poker to estimate stories, and such meetings will also help the PO to know the size of his backlog. Refinements are not easy, especially in the beginning. It is not a simple task to estimate something, especially when you have to factor in so many conditions which would affect your final estimation. A wrong estimation may lead to the team not reaching the sprint goal, and that is a lot of pressure, especially when facing business questions. But don't worry. From my experience, I can say that QAs do not make use of this meeting to its full potential and also make some mistakes. The first mistakes QAs make is that they stay quietly in a corner, not discussing anything and not helping the conversation with developers. No, don't do this. First of all, you as a QA should give your own estimate to the product backlog task. And more importantly, you should not add this estimate as a separate estimate in the ticket, but you should add it to the development estimate. Why should you do this? Well, you know as much as me that whenever a developer implements something, it is not always bug-free, and sometimes that ticket is moved from in progress to test, to in progress, to test, to in progress, to test multiple times. What happens when you have a development estimate separate from a QA estimate? Well, usually the time that it goes from QA to in progress to QA multiple times is taken out of the QA estimate, and business asks the QA, why did it take so long for you to test this? This shouldn't be the case. So this back and forth from in progress to QA in progress should be thought of and added to the estimate. And that is why we shouldn't have two separate estimates, but we are one development team, so we should have one estimate. You won't get it right straight away, and that's not a problem. This estimate will improve over time, but it is always important to raise your voice and say, guys, usually when you estimate a ticket with 5 user stories, this goes from in progress to test about 3 times. Can we please include that in the estimate? And also, for me to test this will probably take 2 days. Perfect. You add that all together, you add it in the ticket, and that will be one final estimate of the development team. Finally, a mistake which I also think QAs make during the estimation meeting is something which I think we have already discussed briefly. Automated tasks. Automated tasks should be separate tickets and not part of the feature stories. This is why we add automated tasks to the team backlog and not to the product backlog. When you include an estimate for the automated test within a story in the product backlog, you are firstly increasing the time for a feature to go live for nothing. In my opinion, automated tests should not be part of definition of done, as this will reduce the number of tickets a team can commit to during the sprint, and the features will have higher estimates. So I don't think that is just. Secondly, you are setting yourself up for failure. Why? Because if the team doesn't manage a feature within the estimated time frame, guess what will be given up? You guessed it, the automation. The automation for that feature will be forever forgotten because it will be not a separate ticket in the team backlog, and that feature will never be automated. So to recap, always give an estimate for how long you think it will take to test a feature. Do not list that estimate down separately but together with a development estimate. Remind developers that the tickets will be pushed back and they are not always perfect, and to not include an estimate for automation tasks within the same task, but the automation task should be created as a separate task and put in the team backlog. Awesome. So I mentioned automation quite a lot, but how does automation fit into Scrum? In actual fact, automation is a tester's best friend in Scrum as well. This is particularly true in a Scrum project, as a QA must perform full functionality testing of the new features, as well as making sure that all previous features are still working every single time. Therefore, having an automated regression suite will help you save time and also provide rapid feedback if a feature is working or not, even before being assigned to the tester. So automated tests can tell the developer, hey, this is not working, don't assign it to the tester yet, make sure the test is passing. Before I continue, I'd also like to point out one thing. QAs have this mentality of testing everything, but in actual fact, QAs should not test everything. Just because a new feature is coming up does not mean that you need to automate it. Be smart on what to automate. Something which could help is the automation matrix created by Andrea Jones, where you give a separate score for gut feeling, risk, value, cost efficiency, and history. Depending on the final score, you can decide if to automate a feature or not. Andrea Jones explains this much better than I'm going to explain it now in a number of YouTube videos that she has uploaded. So if you just Google Andrea Jones automation matrix, you'll find a lot of videos to help you explain this a bit better. But let us give just 2 examples now. So we have 2 features, registration and forgot password. The first thing we need to do is say, should we automate this? Yes or no, so that will go under gut feeling. In my opinion, both registration and forgot password should be automated. Awesome. Next is risk. The risk is calculated using two multiplied scores. The first score is how much is it used by the user? Well, every user will use registration at least once, so I definitely give that a 5. And the second is the impact it would cause the user. So if the registration is not working, a user cannot register, and that means that we lost the user forever. So I'd also give that a 5. So I have 5 times 5. The first score for registration would be 25. Forgot password, how much is it used by users? Hopefully not too much, so maybe I'll give that a 2. And secondly, what impact would it cause the users if it's not working? Probably it will cause a high impact because if they forgot their password, they cannot log in, thus they cannot use your application. So I gave that a 5. 5 times 2 is 10. Awesome. We described the risk. Next up, the value. Value, also calculated on 2 scores. The first score is, does the test provide new information if the test fails? If the test for registration fails, this is going to provide very valuable information, so I'd give that a 5. And the priority to fix the bug. If registration is not working, I am definitely sure that the product owner will put that up at the very top of his priority list. So I'd also give that a 5. So I have a 25. For the forgot password feature, I would use the same mindset. So if the forgot password feature is not working, it will result in very valuable information created by the test. And if it is not working, I also think the product owner put it very high in the list to be fixed. So that will also be at 25. Next, I have the cost efficiency. So how quickly would it take you as a QA to finish automating this task? And how easy is it to script? When it comes to registration, through my experience, this is quite easy and quite quick. So I also gave it a 25. On the other hand, the forgot password functionality may be a bit more tricky. Why? Because you are including sending emails, receiving emails, logging into an email to retrieve a code, for example. So instead, I gave how quick it would take to automate a 3, and also how easy it is to script another 3, which will give us a 9. Finally, history. Historic failures of tests within a similar area. For example, similar features to the registration. I gave this a 2. And historic failures of the test. So how many times the registration test is failing? Hopefully not so many times. So I gave this a 3 with a final score of 6. In the forgot password feature, I gave it a much lower score with the historic failures within a similar area of 2 and the historic failure of a test of 1, which will get a 2. So now I have all the scores of the values. When it comes to registration, we get an 81, and we get the forgot password, we get a 46. When we look at the blocks, we have do not automate, possibly automate, and definitely automate. In this case, registration ends up in the definitely automate, while the forgot password ends up in the possibly automate. So when it comes to registration, it's a no-brainer. This is something that definitely needs to be automated. But what about the forgot password? Possibly automate. Should I? Shouldn't I? This is when you have to discuss with your Scrum team if this feature should be automated or not. And as a team, you decide on this together if this feature, in this case the forgot password, should be automated or not. Obviously, any features which end up in the don't automate block, obviously in my opinion, shouldn't be automated using the automation matrix by Andrea Jones. So that was a small recap of how the automation matrix works. Okay, so now we know what to automate. We also know that we need to create separate tasks for automation tickets and put them in the team backlog. And finally, we also know that we need to raise awareness during this sprint planning that, hey, I have tickets in my team backlog that I want to automate, and I want to automate them during the sprint. What we still did not discuss is when is the best time to automate. Well, the fact is that a QA really needs to know how to manage time. But in my opinion, the best time to automate tickets is in the beginning of the sprint. Why? Because in the beginning of the sprint, devs should just have taken up new tasks and started coding. That is the perfect time where the QA would be quiet and would have some free time in order to start automating. Another good time to automate is when the sprint is dedicated to refactoring or increasing unit test coverage. This is a golden opportunity as time to automate, a whole sprint dedicated to automation. What more could you want? It is important that you do not use the "I'll automate if I'll have time" excuse, as this will always lead to "I don't have time to automate." You have to fight for your time, and hopefully using the mentioned tips and tricks that I mentioned, this will help you get closer to that very particular goal. The final slide I'm going to be talking about is a very, very popular question, which probably every QA has asked. Can I be both a QA and a Scrum Master? I know that in this conference there was a talk just about this topic, but I had to try to recap it through my own personal experience. The very reason why we ask this question is simple. Every company will probably go through a Scrum transition. In the beginning, when transitioning to Scrum, we will not have a Scrum Master because the business or the company will not want to invest in something before they prove that it actually works. Fine. So we'll do the Scrum training and we'll start adopting Scrum methodologies and policies. But the first blocker that they will get, who would like to be the Scrum Master? Probably, or 99% of the time, it is the QA who raises up his hand and says, I would like to do this. And this is for a simple reason. The reason is that QAs and Scrum Masters possess a lot of similar qualities and skill sets. For example, communication. The QA doesn't communicate just to one person, but they communicate to the front-end developers, back-end developers, product owners, Scrum Masters, stakeholders. The same for a Scrum Master. The Scrum Master has to talk to everyone within the team and outside the team. So that is one skill which is similar. Another skill which is similar is that QAs love processes and they're having everything organized. This is something very important for a Scrum Master, because a Scrum Master needs to make sure that meetings start on time, that they do not take too long, etc., etc. This is awesome for a QA, as they also possess this quality. But, and a huge but, should a QA and a Scrum Master be defined as one role? Well, from my opinion and experience, try it out. Yes, it makes sense. But only try it out for a short period of time, for example, 3 sprints, and try it out for the selfish reason to see if you as a QA would like to progress your career as a Scrum Master. And that would be the only reason. It is impossible that you can do both jobs. A Scrum Master is a full-time job, and so is a QA. So by putting the Scrum Master role added to your 8-hour job, obviously you will start taking out some QA tasks which you do on a daily basis. Most of the time, these will be tasks from your team backlog, therefore it would be, for example, the automated tasks. So my advice to you is, yes, try it out. Put up your hand. Say, I would like to try it on a part-time basis, but I would only like to try it for a very limited time. For example, 4 sprints. The Scrum Master role can then be shared throughout the development team. So as a QA, you can start the first 4 sprints, then one of the developers can take up the role for another 4 sprints and keeps on going round robin. Why? This will help the business realize that they actually need a Scrum Master, and as a QA, you won't be overwhelmed with all the work and doing 2 full-time jobs at once. The development team will also appreciate the need of a Scrum Master. And how will this help? Well, when the business and the development team agree that yes, a Scrum Master is needed, when the vacancy is open and you as a QA or as a person would like to take that role, you would be first in line to apply for the Scrum Master role and take that as your next career step. So make sure to not burn yourself out. Yes, try it out, but make sure to do it for a limited amount of time just to see if you like it as a career path or not. Yes, you will be helping the development team, but the Scrum Master role should be shared throughout the development team. A good time frame would definitely be between 3 to 4 sprints each. So like that, everyone can appreciate the Scrum Master role. That is actually it for me. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Please feel free to continue asking questions in the question panel. But if you don't manage to ask a question today, or maybe think about a question in the future, please feel free to email me at andrea.borg@testautomation.com or contact us on Twitter with our slug @testautomation. And I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Andrea. You did really great. Your experience is so marvelous, amazing, so excellent. Just take a breath. We get a couple of questions for you to answer, so let me just read it.
Awesome.
Okay. The first question comes from Adrian. Who should be the guardian of the definition of done? Who should check that the ticket meets the DoD and no shortcuts were done? Is it the PO, Scrum Master, developers?
Awesome. So this guardian role, I would suggest that it is the QA who guides definition of done. It's very important that the QA make sure that the checklist is being adhered to. Obviously, it shouldn't be the sole responsibility of the QA, but the whole development team, as I mentioned before. But a QA, to improve what I was mentioning before, should definitely keep an eye open, because if a ticket does not confirm with the definition of done checklist that we have mentioned before, it will bite the QA back first. So yes, I would definitely take it upon the QA to be the guardian and make sure that the team is sticking to the definition of done. It can be a shared responsibility, yes, but the QA can take it upon themselves to actually be the guardian. Yes, for sure.
Thank you, Andrea. Just the next question goes from Jana Rule Jake. If a user story has many bugs, so it is possible to spill over to the next sprint, or we close within sprint?
Cool. So, really good question. So the thing is, this will be a lesson learned, right? So you will have to end the sprint and you will have to say that the sprint goal was not achieved. Yes, the user story would have to be moved over to the next sprint. But the main important thing is that during the retrospective, you actually discuss why there were so many issues, why this ticket was moved from one sprint to the next. It is only when you have these examples and these scenarios where you will actually learn to, one, improve your estimates, and also know and pinpoint some problems within your development team. So yes, very good question. And yes, definitely the ticket should be moved from one sprint to the next. And the most important part is to have a conversation why you did not achieve that sprint goal. So this mistake will not happen again.
Okay, thank you, Andrea.
Okay.
Just a quick reminder to our audience, don't be shy to ask questions, please. If you want something to clarify, please share your questions and put them on the QA panel on the right. The next question goes from Adrian. If QAs add their testing tickets with story points to the sprint, how does it affect the team velocity? Does it make the planning more difficult in the future because the story points of QA tasks count differently than the ones for the new features and something like this, etc.?
Okay, so when we're talking about testing tickets, I think we're talking about maybe automated tickets or maybe researching some tools, etc. Okay, so these tickets, as I mentioned before, should be added to the team backlog and not to the product backlog. Tickets added to the team backlog don't necessarily need story points. It is only tickets added to the product backlog which need story points. This makes the items in team backlog very flexible. So when an item in the team backlog is moved from one sprint to the next, it's okay, it's not a big deal. It is only a big deal when these items are from the product backlog. So to answer the question, tickets in the team backlog do not need to be estimated. They have more flexibility than the product backlog. And the reason for this is that because the items in the product backlog are user focused. Items in the team backlog are not user focused. So the user and the stakeholders would be more interested from the tickets in the product backlog rather than from the team backlog. So the team backlog items will be used more to fill up spaces and gaps. So for example, I mentioned before the QA being on vacation. The developers can take tickets from the team backlog to fill up the time, and maybe a QA which won't be working a lot at the moment because the team is still discussing a lot, technicalities, blah, blah, blah. He would take up tickets from his team backlog. So the team backlog would be there to help the team velocity actually, and not decrease it. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Really, it was a great question as well. We move on to the next question from Mike. You mentioned combination of QA and Scrum Master. What about combination of QA and DevOps? Who should be responsible for that if there is no DevOps around?
Awesome. Okay, this is why I love QA, because we're good at everything. And that's why it makes this such a good question, right? So we know a bit of what the product owner does, we know a bit about what the Scrum Master does. And this is because of our skill that we communicate with everyone. So we actually know bits and pieces of what everyone is doing around. The tricky part about DevOps is that different companies adopt a different DevOps mentality. So some teams have separate DevOps teams, which I do not agree with, but that is how it is most of the time. And some companies actually have DevOps within the development team. And that is the best case scenario. So if you do not have a separate DevOps team outside the development team, but the idea is that the DevOps will be part of the development team, yes, a QA can assume a part-time DevOps role for the same reason as a Scrum Master. So for one, to see if you prefer the DevOps role as a career progression instead of the QA career progression. And for the second reason, to show business that, hey, we need DevOps. And I cannot cope with being both a QA and DevOps at the same time. But yes, being a QA and knowing how to do DevOps will really help, and will really help show the data to the business that, yes, we actually do need a DevOps within the development team.
Oh, yes, thank you, Andrea. I like this questions a lot.
Awesome.
Okay, let's move on to the next question from
Sure.
Dilip Castle. Do we need to prepare a test plan for every sprint?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on what is being committed during the sprint, right? So if you have a sprint, as I mentioned before, which is a refactoring sprint, a sprint which is only from the team backlog, a sprint with unit tests, with refactoring items, you do not need a test plan for that sprint, for example. So it is on a very case-by-case basis. Another thing is that usually test plans are done for huge features, right? And in Scrum, we pride ourselves in splitting up features in very, very small bits and pieces. So in actual fact, you'll probably have a test plan ready for multiple sprints. Why? Because you would create a test plan for this huge feature. And that feature will be split down into very, very minor components, which will go out throughout multiple sprints. So you'll have one test plan ready for multiple sprints. Again, it is a case-by-case basis. I really do hope that you do split features in such a way. But again, you have to see, as a QA, you have to be intelligent enough to know that for the sprint, yes, I need to create a new test plan because we're going to focus just on one feature. The sprint goal will be just this feature. So I have to create a test plan for that.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. The questions are over. I want to thank you.
Awesome.
Thank our audience for the questions. We have great upcoming topic for our conference today. I can remind you the session has been recorded. It will be available with all the materials by the link later. And Dilip Kessler wants to know about product owner. Okay, let's read it.
Okay.
If PO is no comfort on the estimation, I provided end user delivery dates before. What is your approach?
Okay, so if I understand this question properly, is that the development team gives their estimate, the QA gives their estimate, they add it, but the product owner is not happy with the QA estimate part. Okay, so if the product owner is not happy with the QA estimate part, the only approach that I would give the product owner is to explain step by step why you came up with that estimate. And most of the time, you have data, you have your own experience to back you up that that estimate is actually correct. So you can tell the product owner, listen, from previous sprints, when I had a feature which was similar to this, I gave a very low estimate, but we always went above the estimate. And you can say, I learned from my experience that that estimate wasn't good enough. So you have to ask the product owner, do you really care that we're going to achieve the sprint goal during the sprint? Or do you want me to say a very ridiculous low sprint estimate, and then at the end of the sprint we say, we didn't achieve the sprint goal, God knows why. But You will know why, because you will have your own experience to actually improve the estimates sprint by sprint. So the approach you should take, yes, show the product owner why you gave that estimation, show him previous and past data to back you up, and he will have to agree. Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. Andrea, I can remind you the session has been recorded. It will be available with all the materials by the link later. I would like to thank our speaker for the excellent talk, and thank you, our audience, for your participation in the Community Z, QA Days, and this topic session. It has been a pleasure meeting you here. I welcome you to move on to the next topic session. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for participating. Thank you, QA Days. Ciao, ciao.